All right, y'all, good people. We about to do this thing. I decided to, since this is like one of the last little sessions, I'm gonna do like my best to give us a deep dive into literally everything you need to know about React in what is this, 90 minutes? So let's see. Let's do it. Let's just do like a nice real big, it should feel like a big overview, refresh. You've been following along, but you might also kind of get tied into some new stuff depending on how much time we have left. Sound good? Just give me some thumbs up if we're ready to rock, because I'm gonna just jump in. Cool. Thank y'all. I bet. So let's do this thing, y'all. So React, right? Everybody wants to be a web developer. I think being a web developer these days is like a necessity, because the web carries so much significance in our experiences day to day. The cool thing about the web is that everybody can get access to the web. Mobile is a little bit of a different space because at the end of the day, people have certain different operating systems on their phones. And then computer OSs also just differ, right? The main operating system your computers utilize can vary between all of the big players and whatnot. The web is just a ubiquitous experience that people can tap into and utilize in so many creative ways. Being a web developer, I'm sorry, I'm trying to grab my charger and talk about React in the same time. The thing about the web, right, is that one thing you got to keep in mind is that there's two types of experiences on the web. There's front-end experiences and there's back-end experiences. Back-end experiences are all things that we call server-side experiences. They're things that happen on an actual server that's hosted somewhere. Front-end experiences are client-side experiences, things that happen for a user, right? The majority of what we know about front-end web development happens utilizing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? HTML being the structure of web pages, CSS being the style of web pages, and JavaScript being the action that you utilize to make web pages interactive. When you're working with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, all three of them are necessary to create web-based experiences, but the process of connecting JavaScript to HTML and CSS can be a little bit, it's a simple process, but it requires a lot of extra functions to be created that we call DOM manipulation functions that can get a little clunky and can be, become a little bit more complicated than you might want. So developers are always looking for experiences that make their lives easier. And the developers that created React to be a JavaScript library to make the process of building your front end web experiences easier, because you can utilize a JavaScript library that was written specifically to make the processes of manipulating HTML and CSS easier across the board. So that's really the big selling point of React. And essentially, the point of what we've been talking about is how to use React, right? And so if you're trying to get started with React, the first thing you got to do is you need to get React to be utilized in any of your code bases. There's a number of different ways that you can use React. You can add React to a current website that you might have, like regular HTML, CSS, JavaScript website, by importing some libraries and some scripts. And you can utilize React as as little as you want in a existing website. So you can do transformations of old websites into React, or you can do what we've been doing, which is utilizing tool chains, which are scripts that have been created to make your installation of React easier. So you can start your projects with React and utilize React in that way, right? So the most important tool chain, there's a lot of different tool chains to say for the first that you can install and utilize. There's some that are better for you when you're learning. There's some that are better for you when you're doing production ready applications. There's some that people can just customize just to solve specific issues in the developer experiences. The one we got most familiar with, and the one that you should get most familiar with if you're getting started with React, is the Create React App toolchain, which allows you to create a single page React application that you can easily customize, you can easily test, and you can easily have running on a local server that you can see changes on very, very quickly. Once you get a little bit more professional with like understanding, like you already use Create React App, you know how to build your Create React apps. The other two of the other more popular tool chains that are really popular are the Next.js tool chain and the Gatsby tool chains. Next.js is great for server-side rendering, which is necessary at certain points in creating your experiences on the web so that they load faster for the user. Gatsby is a great alternative to just the regular Create React app because it's lighter weight. It doesn't have as much in it, so that it makes it easier to build static websites that aren't as dynamic. And so tool chains are great. The Create React App toolchain is a very simple toolchain to install. In order to do anything with React, you need to install Node on your machine. Node is a JavaScript runtime engine that allows for you to run JavaScript on your computer. JavaScript can run on browsers. Browsers have the engines for JavaScript already installed, but if you want to run JavaScript on your computer, you need Node. And whenever you install Node, you can install it, and it also comes with NPM, which is the package manager for Node-based projects. React is a project that utilizes Node, so it is a Node-based project, and the Create React App toolchain is a command that Node executes in order to install all the packages, all the files you need to get your project up and running. So on this side of my terminal, I've already installed Node. I can check it out with node -- version. I can do, if I want to create a React app, right? You already know npx, like it says here, npx create React app, everything React. And so what the Create React App toolchain does is it installs everything that you need to utilize for using React in a development capacity, right? So it runs a couple scripts in the terminal, and the scripts do certain things like install your files or install packages it needs, organize your files, and make it so that you can easily deploy your boilerplate code to a local server so you can make changes over time. And so while I was doing that, let's talk a little bit about how React works and some of the main concepts, which we talked through at length throughout this last few weeks and months. So React is all about making the experience of writing JavaScript that utilizes that connects with HTML and manipulates HTML and CSS easier. The way it does that is it uses a lot of libraries that it creates. It creates a bunch of functions that allow for you to more easily customize the HTML utilizing JavaScript. So how it does that is by creating what's called a virtual DOM. The DOM stands for the Document Object Model. It's a very important API in web development that is utilized in regular JavaScript and HTML and CSS so that you can connect JavaScript to your HTML objects and manipulate them, and as well as your CSS styling. And what React does that's very special is it created a virtual DOM. It created what was called the React DOM. And the React DOM is essentially like a layer on top of any website that's using React has this layer on top of the actual DOM that is written all in JavaScript. So it makes it so that React can very easily change things about that virtual DOM utilizing the JavaScript, which is why it made things a lot easier for you as a developer, because the changes could be manipulated faster because of the way that the JavaScript was optimizing the changes that were being made and whatnot. All of React is all about utilizing that virtual DOM in order to render elements that will then be able to be interacted with and then changed over time based on user interaction on the websites. How it does that is by way of markup syntax called JSX JSX is essentially a JavaScript markup language that allows for you to define the visual components and elements that you want to see on your website, but you can write them in JavaScript versus HTML. They look like HTML, and you know what we talked about is that they actually are all of the HTML tags that people might be familiar with are pre-built into React and JSX so that you can use them very easily in getting your projects set up, right? So here we see like the heading and some text, but what happens is this is written in a JavaScript file that then gets converted into HTML via the React DOM that we just talked about. The cool thing about the JSX syntax is that you can utilize JavaScript above it, below it, inside of it, everywhere. So it makes it so that you can actually keep a JavaScript oriented file and then have those visual components that you might need to show onto the screen, right? You can utilize the JavaScript in a lot more creative ways. So here is an example of us still creating like a variable in JavaScript, but then also passing that variable into the JSX so that this element that gets shown up is tied to some data that exists in regular JavaScript. And so that's like a low level understanding of like the big picture idea of you could use JavaScript very specifically to make all of these experiences that are going to translate to the to your front end experiences. If what I'm saying makes sense and you're rocking with it, you know, drop some thumbs up so I know that we on the same page. Drop some love in the chat. Be like, you know what I'm saying, this makes sense. This makes sense. That'd be good so that I can keep it going. So, you know, JSX is all about like making it easier for you to render elements onto the screen. Rendering elements are the elements that you're rendering are all JavaScript, like we're talking about. And how it works with React is that you end up rendering, and the word rendering in React is a special word that means make this show up on the page, right? And so everything that you're doing with React is about rendering these elements onto the screen so that they can be interacted with, they can be seen, they can be changed, they could you know be manipulated in whatever ways you want. And so React has some special functions with the React DOM functionality that allows you to choose where you want to render specific elements into the screen. Some of it feels a little bit like magic, but really it's just some JavaScript functions behind the scene that identify certain parts of a regular HTML file and then says, okay, I'm going to insert the React here, right? So behind, you know, under the hood, React is just regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's just that the JavaScript libraries that people wrote on top of that regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript experience allow for you to write that code in a lot more sophisticated ways that are predominantly JavaScript focused. But, you know, what we're familiar with is this idea that, like, especially in the Create React app, is that, you know, we render a particular set of elements into one of the into our HTML file in a unique way. How we do that, and, you know, kind of the core of what React does and how it does that is through this concept called components. Components are essentially these building blocks that identify the elements that you want to render onto the screen, but do so in a reusable format, in like a more organized format. So instead of just saying, okay, hey, I want a header and I want an image and I want a paragraph and this, that, and third, and they're all separated elements, you can create what's called a component and say, hey, I want a profile, right? And so it becomes a lot more descriptive. It becomes a little bit easier for you to say, hey, I want to show this big section of things on the screen, and then you can choose what elements you want to create that particular experience, right? So components you could think of as, like, I like to think of them like Lego blocks. Like, you can define the Lego blocks and you can stack them up in the ways that make sense for whatever page you're building, right? So if I was looking at this page, at the React page that we're looking at, one big component might be this big header nav bar kind of scenario up here. You might make one at the top, like another bar for this, like support Ukraine post that they have here. These might be different components. And if for the nav bar, for instance, that component might comprise of a couple elements like the logo and these little text buttons, right? And the search bar, et cetera, right? So you use this idea of components to break down websites into different, I don't want to say the word components, but like that's kind of where it comes from, right? Like we're breaking the website down into different components, and you can make an actual file that represents that component using React. Components are essentially functions and like objects in JavaScript that allow for you to essentially do one thing. The biggest thing that functions have to do is render elements, right? Render things to the screen. The way it does that is by returning some JSX as an object. So whether you write your components as functions, there's also a way to write them as classes. Both of them are meant to be a way for you to identify the elements you want to return, those Lego elements, right, and the building blocks, and return those elements in a way that can be rendered on the screen. So whenever I call the welcome component, it knows, hey, I'm going to return this bit of elements into wherever you said you wanted it to be, right? So we use functions, we use classes, but both serve the same purpose of rendering elements to the screen. And that's the job that components play in the React landscape. Functional components are a lot newer. So more recent posts, you'll see people using functional components a lot more. Classes were the default for a while. So people in more traditional posts will use this. You'll see a mix of them in different professional environments, but both can occupy the same role in React, which is to create a component, which is to say, I want to create this type of custom object that is going to define a set of elements that I'm going to render on the screen eventually. Components are really the essence of how we work with React as developers. We write components and we use the components to create these experiences on the web for our users to identify with. Now, components have two very important data-related principles to them that are important to know about. The first is called props. So after you render a component, you might want to pass some data into that component so that it can use that data in how it shows up, how it renders elements inside of itself, right? And so the idea is that in order to pass data from into a component, we use this concept called props. Props are essentially data that get passed into a component. A component would use props to say, hey, I received this data and I want to use it to do something inside of my rendering stage. Props are defined outside of a component, but the component can access it inside of itself and utilize it for whatever it wants to do. So like in this example, this component received the props, but it's now returning that prop as a part of this heading, right? So the idea is that props are data that can get passed into a component and from one component to another. And the point of props makes it so that you can also create components to be a lot more modular. So you can create one component, but change the prop so that you don't have to reinvent the same component over and over again. If the only thing that needs to change, for instance, in this scenario where we have a welcome message, right? The only thing that would need to change is the actual message or the name for someone in the message, right? So why not pass that as a variable or as data that can change via prop, right? So that we have one component that we can call multiple times utilizing this different data. So props make components reusable in a lot of ways because you don't have to redefine a component that's doing something over and over again. You can just pass the thing that is changing about that component as a prop so that you can more easily create a seamless experience without having to write multiple components. So things like buttons, things like if you think about you think about any experience on the web where you might want to have some similar kind of user experience, you might be able to achieve it with one component that changes some things about itself using props versus having to create multiple components. So components, props. The second big piece of data related things that you need to know about how components work is called state, right? So whereas props are data that the component receives from another component, state is data that the component can create for itself and manage and maintain for itself inside of itself. The biggest difference between props and state is that props can't be changed. So if a component receives some data from another component, it can't suddenly just change that data to be something else. But with state, the data can be changed as many times as the component wants, because the state data is only maintained inside of a component, right? Other components will never know about the state. In order for another component to know about another component in any kind of way, there would have had to be some exchange of props between those components for there to be that knowledge, right? So props is the only way for two components to communicate with each other. State is data that a component can maintain about itself inside of itself in order to keep a record of important things that need to be recorded and whatnot. State is a very interesting concept, because if you think about it, like it being called state is all about this idea that like there's different states of your user experience, right? There might be the state where a user is logged in versus the state where a user is logged out, right? And in that, you might want to keep some type of design a component to react one way when somebody's logged in versus when somebody's logged out, right? And I'm trying to show. So props and state are the two ways that components make data accessible and use data to kind of show visual elements in unique ways. Components follow a particular life cycle. A life cycle in React really just describes the journey that a component goes on in terms of rendering its data and showing the rendering its data and then getting that data shown to users on the screen, right? So here's the complete component lifecycle. Components follow three basic processes. One's called mounting, the other is called updating, and the third is called unmounting. When a component mounts, that's it being created. It's it being rendered onto the screen for the first time, right? There's a couple functions that get called there, like the constructor function, render function, component didn't mount. And those happen when a component is being created for the first time. When a component is already created and it needs to update, well, then the updating stage happens where components can continuously re-render. What makes components re-render is important to know, because when a component re-renders, it changes what is shown on the screen, right? So there's only three things that can make that happen in React. That's whenever a component either gets some new props, like some data gets passed to it from a different component, or the component changes something about the state that it's maintaining, and so it'll refresh the page based on that data. So updates are what make React pages change. What makes a React page update is whether it gets some new props or whether the state gets changed, or whether a user actually forces it to update, which is a pretty rare case. Then the last phase is unmounting. So that's when, like, say for instance, you have a component, like say we have a sign up component, and we're showing that sign up component to a user at this present moment in time. But what happens is when the user types into the sign up component, maybe it's a form, they type in their data and they press enter, right? Well, what happens in the back end is the user gets signed in, right? So now the sign up page turns into a different page. It turns into like a welcome page or something, right? So unmounting would be the process of that old sign up page being taken off the screen and the new page of the welcome page being shown up. So components unmount when they're not being utilized anymore. Knowing this life cycle is important because all components follow it, but the difference is that in certain components, you can tap into these methods. So if you're using class-based components, you can actually call these methods and overwrite them and write code that happens at any of these different moments. But functional components follow the same process and follow these rules in that they mount, they update, and then they unmount. That's how every single component works. React is a very popular library because of the fact that it allows you to really easily handle events. So event handling is a thing that JavaScript libraries have to do constantly because the web is all about user interaction. And so there's a number of HTML events that happen, right? Clicks, taps, drags, drops, changes to forms, submitting buttons that are submitting data from forms. Like there's so many different events. React makes it very easy to handle those events because it's all JavaScript already, right? And so you can utilize the similar HTML event handlers in order to pass JavaScript functions that actually do something from the same file, right? So previously what happened was you needed to have your HTML defined and then you needed JavaScript defined, but with React, it's just all JavaScript. You use the JSX to define what you want to see. You use the event handler from HTML with the JavaScript syntax now, and you can pass JavaScript functions in to solve those things. We use events very commonly in everything we do in the web, right? Whether it's with forms, whether it's with buttons, right? There's always something going on that a user's interacting with and we want to respond to. So you can use React very easily to create those experiences where if, for instance, a form is being submitted and somebody's tapping a button that's going to submit the form, you can create a function like this function handle submit that will run whenever that event happens. And all of this is happening in the same place, maybe a component that you call form, so that you can keep all of that logic in the same place, which makes your life a little bit easier because everything's happening in one place versus 3 different files if you were using regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So React is very helpful for all types of unique JavaScript, or the usual JavaScript work that you would expect out of web-based libraries, like older ones like jQuery or anything like that. But it goes a step further in allowing you to also visualize the elements you want using JavaScript, and then so you can pass JavaScript data into those elements very easily, and so makes handling events that much easier as well. One of the big things that makes React special though, and because it's built in JavaScript and it's a programming language oriented system, is that you can use conditionals in very unique ways, right? Conditionals in programming are all about Booleans, if, else, and ands and ors and whatnot. And so the idea with conditional rendering is let's just break that down. Well, conditionals we just talked about. They're those operators that are logical operators that do certain things, returning true and false. Rendering is that process we were just talking about, which is a component being made to show something onto the screen, right? So conditional rendering is all about utilizing those logical operators, those Boolean functions, and choosing then based on those Boolean functions and values what is going to render on the screen, right? So this is an important concept in React because this is what makes React a very flexible library to use when you know that what you're building is going to be like experiences that are going to be dynamic and customized by certain little user interactions, right? Like maybe, stylistically, you want the styles of the page to change based on certain things going on based on that the user's doing. Maybe you are wanting to render one component when a user has one property versus other components, right? Like if you think about, you know, one common experience that's happening on the web right now is are like paywalls on websites, right? You see paywalls all the time. It's like, oh, you want to go look at the news, there's like paywall, like they just throw it at you. You can create those types of experiences. Not to say that you want to, but you can create those types of experiences with React very simply by saying, okay, is this user paid? If so, show them the rest of the site. If not, show them this version of the site, right? So that type of conditional logic you can do very easily with React to render your components in a way that is based on true or false values, right? And it's as simple as this. Let's say you have these two components. Here's two functional components, both returning some heading, right? And then you might create a wrapper function around them. So that is going to just determine which of these functions, which of these components am I going to show based on a specific property, like is the user logged in? If the user's logged in, maybe I'm gonna return this. If not, maybe I'm gonna return this, right? So again, because this is all JavaScript, you can use the JavaScript in these creative ways to transform the experiences your users are having on the front end side of your application. Another big thing that makes React cool is the fact that you can use lists and keys of, you can use lists of data and render those in very unique ways as well. One thing that's cool about React is if you have an array of JSX elements, so those elements we were talking about before, those regular like HTML looking like elements, if you have arrays of those of that type of elements, you can visualize those very easily as a list of data in React. And so it's very common in React that you'll use an array of data, right? You know, like a numbered array of data, and use all of the cool JavaScript array functions that are built into the JavaScript programming language in order to transform, you know, static arrays of data into actual arrays of JSX, right? That will then be returned onto the screen for the user to utilize in unique ways. So we consistently use like the array map function and, you know, functions like that allow for you to manipulate static bits of data and turn them into more dynamic pieces of visual content for your users. The cool thing is with this, you know, list of items, which is now the result of this array map, array maps return another array. So it takes this random array and then it says, oh, I'm going to make this array of numbers into an array of list items. But now you have this list item and you have this list items array that's held in this data. And you're then able to return that whole array of data as if it was just a regular bit of element, right? A regular element in JavaScript or a regular element in JSX that might want to be visualized. So React makes not only does it make the JavaScript not only makes the React easier, React makes use of the JavaScript to make your experiences on creating these dynamic pages that much more simple to use, especially if you're building things based on data. So most web pages are built around data in some capacity, like list of any kind, right? And rather than have to list out everything, you could use arrays and use these JavaScript principles to make your code a lot more efficient and optimized for future use cases and whatnot. Another big concept on the web, like just ubiquitous experiences that people need to know about, are forms, right? And web-based forms are everywhere. You know, we always are putting in data and sending data. Forms are an interesting experience because they're kind of are a bridge between client and server side JavaScript in a way. In that, like, you know, a user might type some data and then forms might be responsible for sending that data to a database or sending that data somewhere else, right? And so they kind of sometimes hold the key to that experience of like the front end and the back end. But, you know, just like we said before, every HTML element you can think of is already built as an intrinsic element in React. I should preface that and say not maybe all of them, but a majority of them. But forms are definitely a built-in JSX element. So you can use them just like you would in HTML to create these form experiences. And like we just talked about with events, you can, tie these different elements into event-driven JavaScript to run when you need them to. And so this is where these ideas of like state and props come back, is in the fact that you might want to keep track of the data going on inside of a form, right? And so using things like state makes sense for that, and passing that data back to someone else, you might use props. So state props continuously come up when it comes to like utilizing React, but forms are one of those things that are such a common experience that we utilize all the time in React. Some of the last couple of concepts that are made part of the main concepts, especially here in the React docs, is this concept of lifting state up, which is, sometimes you want to make it so that multiple components understand data that's changing over time. So it's just important to know that like you can architect and design your applications in a way that passes the state to other components, right? So we talked about state is data that components maintain inside of themselves. But if I am maintaining some data about whether a user is logged in or not, maybe I would want to share that data with other components, right? And so I might want to pass that data up to another component that can then share it with other components as props. So state and props are probably like the most important React concepts that there is. And learning them just takes it's a little bit of a learning curve to understand how like props and state. But the big idea is props get passed from component to component. State is maintained inside of a component. That is like the biggest thing to kind of keep in mind. And yeah, and just thinking about like how state and props work is one of those things that can take a little bit of time. So in general, you got to build React projects to kind of continuously learn how it all works. So yeah, components are reusable. There's a lot of ways for you to like take the data that you create from one component and utilize it in another component. And all of this goes to be utilized in this bigger picture thing of thinking in React, right? Which is all about, like I was saying earlier, taking like what you're trying to build and breaking it down into like the different components that it's made out of. And instead of thinking, I got to build all of this stuff, like I got to build all this stuff, like just like in this top down way, you can break it up into pieces that might be reusable, right? And instead you might save yourself a lot of work because you're building something that is built around these reusable components in a very unique way. So these are the main concepts on the React docs. Going through them can take you as long as it takes you to like read through them, but you also only really get to learn when you build. One other concept that is really important to know about React these days is this concept called hooks. React hooks are essentially a way for you to utilize the same features that come with like class-based components, like I talked about, being able to like, connect to these methods and functions that are tied around the component lifecycle. Hooks gave functions the ability to do similar work without having to turn your component into a class. So they're just a different syntax, but allow you to add valuable insights to your functional components, like state. You can use state in your functional components. And the use state hook is one of those principles of utilizing hooks so that you can change data inside of this component, much like you would with a class, just like we talked about using state. So this is all data that this component might maintain inside of itself. But at the same time, prior to using hooks, we had to use class-based components for a lot of things. The use state hook is an important hook to know when you're trying to keep data maintained inside of a component. The other big important hook to know about is the use effect hook, which allows you to allows you to essentially run code that will happen at specific moments of this component life cycle. So after a component's finished mounting, or after a component's finished updating, or when a component is going to unmount, right? These are functions that you can define in a class-based component. Because in functional components, you don't have them, the use effect hook is the functional component equivalent to that that space, where you can use that hook to define some functions to run at specific moments across the component lifecycle. Hooks are cool. You can build your own, but the use effect and the use state hook are probably the two most important hooks to know about as you're getting started with React. But like I said, getting started within React is not as easy as just like reading through it. You kind of have to kind of jump right in. So what I did earlier was I used that Create React App library that we talked about in order to run a script that created a project for me. One thing to know about when you use the Create React App script is that it will initialize a Git repository for you in your files, which means that if you run git status, oops, my bad. If you run git status in the actual project that you created, you'll see that you have a Git repository set up and for you to use. Git repositories just allow you to store your code in more organized ways, and then you can keep track of the code over periods of time. But one of the things that Create React App does is it starts your project off with this really great ability to save changes over time. So super helpful. But also what it does is it creates a set of scripts and files that become the bare bone basic layout of your React application. So looking through those real quick, the most important files come inside of a directory called the source directory. The source folder has all of the code that relates to the visual elements that we would expect to see on the screen. So the main component that we work with in React is called the app component, the app.js. All React files for the JSX and the components like we were talking about use the JavaScript file syntax, so JS file extension. But we also can add CSS to these files in order to style things more creatively. So importing a CSS file into a JavaScript file is the nature of how we would say, okay, hey, I have this JavaScript file and I want to create some styles for it in CSS. So we still use JSX, we still use JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, even while working with React. And it's just meant to make our lives a lot easier. In order to run or create React App project, you have to first run that command, npx create React App, to create your React project files. It gives you a little helpful output to tell you like some of the commands you can run, as well as tells you, hey, change into that directory and let's make it happen. So change into that directory. So I'm going to npm start. And what npm start does is it runs a local server on port 3000 for you to test out your React code in real time, right? And so it'll start that development server. It'll pop up whatever browser you're using. And once the code actually gets started running with Node, you'll see that your web page will refresh and reload so that you can start utilizing your React files to make these changes to your user experience for your application. So all the changes that we will see is that the main application component that you use in Create React App library is the app.js. The app.js returns some pre-built code when you first use the Create React App that looks something like this. But once you start making changes into the app.js, that's when all of the magic happens and you are off to the races, building your first React application, and getting that web developer bag, what I'm saying, getting that developer guap. And so yeah, the cool thing about how the Create React App library works is it creates this live server for us so that after you have made some changes and you save those changes, Create React App will allow for your changes to be reflected on the actual page. So as I am making changes here on the side, I can go and see those changes kind of happen live on the screen without having to, you know, start and stop any server or anything like that. So it makes it really easy for you as a developer to keep making progress on the changes you want to make, because at the end of the day, you have the server refreshing what needs to be refreshed over time. But it really, what's going on behind the scenes is that React DOM we were talking about is able to manipulate changing the content on the page based on the file structure that we have here. So components are the basic building block of your application. Here's a simple component. This is the app component, so the main default component. This component gets rendered and into our working tree of HTML here in this index.js file, which is the most important, I guess, non-React file in the project structure that Create React App creates. This index.js is a regular JavaScript file that uses the React library functions to do that process of rendering a specific set of elements into some HTML that exists in this public folder here, right? And so this is a regular HTML file. What happens is there's a div down here, and this div gets injected with the React code using that index.js function that we just saw in the source. So again, all that means for anybody that's listening is that we still use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's just utilized in a unique and more sophisticated way. For anyone that studied the way that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript work, you normally use an HTML file, connect JavaScript in that HTML file, and then you can use the JavaScript to change things in the CSS and the HTML. With React, the same thing is going on. We're connecting this React file, and particularly this app that we have as a component, to be rendered into code that will be stored inside of that HTML document eventually, which is how we see it on the screen here. So a lot of sophisticated JavaScript functions, but you don't have to worry about a lot of this or setting it up at all, because Create React App does it for you. And all it needs you to do is go into the app.js and start making your changes. And so that's normally where we begin. Once you use Create React App, you're going to just start off just hacking on these app.js changes you want to make. And like I mentioned before, all components are responsible for returning some JSX. So whether you use a function component, whether you use a class-based component, my bad. Whether you use a class-based component, the idea is the same. You're going to be responsible for returning some JSX that is going to be utilized to render the code eventually onto the screen, right? So here's me just changing that app into a class-based component, right? And so they have a similar role of returning JSX. The structure of the syntax is just a little bit different, right? The biggest thing to know about kind of what we see here with this default file is how the imports of CSS work, right? And so CSS is always going to be the way that you go about styling things. And so in React, it's no different. We use CSS selectors and CSS rules to create styling. And if you want to connect the styling to your components, the simplest way is to use class names. In React, unlike in regular HTML, where this would have just been called a class, we use the class name property, and we can give our elements, We give each individual elements class names that then we can refer to with CSS files. So here's that class name for the .app, which is meant to text a line in the center. So the idea is that, you know, as you're starting a style, and if you're somebody who cares about style, you're going to want to make sure you're using CSS tied to your components, as you can import your CSS into your components and then tie those specific elements to the CSS that you want to show up. And yeah, components are simple to make. Typically in React projects, what we'll see happen very commonly is people create a lot of different components. My bad, that's supposed to be a folder. And so what you'll see normally is like folks create a folder, and inside of that folder is where they'll save all of their components. Components normally get started with a capital letter, and then you get to choose whether you want to do a functional component or a class-based component. There's no real difference at this point in time outside of what syntax used and what kind of methods are outside of come built in. But the idea is the same, right? Every component is responsible for returning some JSX that's going to eventually be on the screen. And so, you know, if you create multiple components, the idea is that you're going to eventually want to connect them, right? And so the biggest thing is that how components get connected is the biggest process kind of like determining like your architecture with React. And how it works is after you define them, after you define components, we normally export them as objects so that we can bring them into other files. So I'll just bring these two components into our app.js component. So I'll import sign in from right. And then as you import your components, then you can render them just like you would a normal element, right? So instead of this heading here, I'm just going to render the sign in component. And that'll just make this change real quick so that we see that, okay, now I'm being asked to sign in, right? And that's how kind of React components work, right? We define these little objects. We can put as much JSX as we want in them. If I want to make this sign in page a little bit more sophisticated, right? Instead of just doing something like an H1, maybe I want to make this a little bit more of a experience for the user. And, you know, it's a form, and, you know, they're responsible for putting in some text for their name and giving us some information, like maybe like a password or something that is going to be utilized in signing them up, right? Right, so maybe I got to put my name in here, put a password in here, and then submit, and then something's supposed to happen, right? So at the end of the day, that's how React works, right? We use these components to create these different experiences on the web, and the data of all of this is what gets fascinating with state and props, and creating the opportunities for your components to for people to make changes, right? So if, for instance, to just show the state and props thing again, right? As a user is potentially signing in to our little application that we're creating here, it might be important for us to keep track of like whether or not the text or the password that they're putting in is correct, right? So we're gonna wanna know, what are they typing in, and, you know, is it the same? Maybe if they're registering, you know how sometimes when you're registering, they ask you to You know, like let's say instead of sign in, this is like a sign up kind of thing. And if this is a sign up page, right? It's common in a sign up page. It's common in a sign up page that you would have, you know, you would ask your users to like verify their password as they're signing up, right? So instead of there being just one password input, you know, we might have two. And then the other thing too is like, you know, most times we see forms for signing up are kind of structured vertically, right? So this might be a good opportunity for me to import like a CSS file. So I might just do that. So I'll just do / style / right. And so I got to create this file. And I might want to just make it so that this form uses flex so that it can display the contents in a unique way. Whoops. And this would help me kind of make some changes. Whoops. Sign in. I don't know why that dog's tweaking on me, y'all. So this would make it so that we can create, we can tie our components to have the specific styles that we would expect. And the biggest thing to understand about React is that, right? Like you create the components, you structure the JSX, you create the experiences that you want your components to have with relationship to the JavaScript. And then that's when things kind of start getting a little bit more sophisticated with relationship to the type of interactions that your users might be having, as well as the big picture kind of ways that you are going to have to work. One thing that gets important to know about how React kind of gets utilized in more big picture senses is, you know, we talked about how it uses state and it uses props, and it does things very specifically to make the process of creating your applications a lot easier to like manage that data. So the big thing that state and props allow for us to do, like we talked about earlier, is that idea of conditional rendering, right? And creating like experiences that are built around conditions. Well, one big conditional thing that is normally, you know, is normally kind of utilized is like this sign up flow, right? So as a user is being signed up, you know, you might want to show them a sign up screen. And then as they're being signed in, you might want to show them a welcome screen, right? I don't know why it is doing this to you, boy. Component source component sign in JS doesn't even exist no more, bro. What you talking about, Willis? So the idea is that, you know, you want to show different experiences in different moments based on the different types of data that is coming up onto that your users are interacting with, right? One of the things that is really important after you kind of do local kind of changes is the whole process of utilizing React for multi-page experiences that are going to be conditional. And that's where the React Router library comes in. And the React Router library is one of those important libraries for like creating experiences that use React and components, but create this kind of like page-like system for making it so that you can create your multi-page websites utilizing the same kind of React concepts that we were just talking about. And this is just a cool example of the fact that because this is all JavaScript based, we can utilize the JavaScript in creative ways to create these experiences where we can add different packages into our React applications as well. So it's not like we have to rely solely on what the React library gives us as a default. We can also use JavaScript, other npm packages to make our experiences that much better. I don't know why I was bugging. I had to just restart the server. But to just make that first point though about like props and whatnot, and how props and state make things that much easier, right? So say for instance, we have this this form, like this sign up form, and we want to have an experience where, you know, users are signing up for our application. So first, you know, a user might be responsible for coming in, putting in their name. We could put a label and you know, kind of have this experience where like, you know, it's a traditional like form-like experience. But you know, you get the idea. Like they might leave their name, they might put their password, and might have to log into the application. Well, in a lot of ways, right, React makes this process pretty simple, like we talked about with events. In order to do that, you might want to keep track of, like, for instance, like, oh, let's say like we want to check that the passwords that users are making are the same, right? Well, this is an example of where you might want to use some state to kind of just keep track of the data that is being passed in our component, right? And so here, just like kind of as a little example, we'll just kind of use the use state hook to store the password, and then we'll use the same thing to store the confirmed password, right? And then essentially, you know, tying this all to event handlers, we can have on change for this input that is tied to a function of some kind that's like this change password function that could take in our JavaScript event and set the password based on the event.target value, right? And same thing for the confirm password, where we might want to have the confirm password also be kind of monitored in a similar way, right? Where as the changes are being made specifically on the part of both these little passwords, right? We can see some changes being made there. Here, I'll just set the value to be the password, and I'll set the value here to be and so one thing we might want to do is, you know, whenever this form gets submitted, right, we might want to validate that there is, you know, that the passwords are the same, right? And so, whoops. And that might just look as simple as saying something like, you know, if password is equal to confirm password, we're going to do something here. Else, you know, we might do something there. And if they're equal, you know, maybe we'll make an alert and say, yay, else alert. No, you got to make these the same. Well, let me make my users that much happier. Gotta make your passwords the same so they know what we're talking about. So yeah, so you might have these, like, you know, this is just a simple concept, a simple idea of like, okay, simple form that we're kind of used to, but maybe whenever this form submits, we want to make sure that we validate those passwords. And this is an example of like all of that level of, like I was talking about, you know, utilizing events in JavaScript to make and using it all in React in that same capacity. And then also we get a sense of this whole idea of like, this is all JavaScript, right? Everything up here is just functions until we get down here and this looks like the HTML, but that's what makes React special and how it is structured. So last thing I'll do is this. And so yeah, like, you know, creating these types of experiences on the web, right? Like creating these types of experiences on the web are good, right? Because we want to make sure that, like, you know, we can give our users experiences that are dynamic, but also are easy for us to maintain as developers, right? And so these kinds of dynamic types of experiences are pretty easy to create with React. And just with the little bit of conditional logic, right, we were able to have these kinds of these things be communicated to the user in a simple way. We see here this whole idea of like passing in the state, right? And using the state to keep track of the data that's changing over time, makes it so that your components can become a little bit more intelligent, which is all a very important part of the process of utilizing React, right? And then to go back to what I was saying, you know, like it keeps going further from this, right? Like, you know, state props and like just utilizing these component infrastructures as they exist are like the beginning. But then like everything that you normally are used to doing on the web-based experiences are built around these concepts. And so, for instance, right, it might be the case that what we want to do is whenever a user actually submits, and like, let's say like whenever this user submits and this password is correct, you know, we want to show them the welcome component instead of the sign up component. Well, we could do that very easily with props, right? And state, like, just like we know, right? In the sense that, okay, we just want to let our component know, hey, the user signed up. We're good for this. We're good to show them something else. How that might work is like a little bit of conditional rendering, right? Where our div inside of our app might want to know whether or not a user is actually signed up. And if they are, we'll show them the welcome screen. If they're not, we'll show them the sign up screen. And so to do that, we might want to use state also in this application that we created, the app.js file, right? And to do that, we saw just now how to do it with a functional component using the hook, but you know, class-based components also utilize it in a unique way as well. And so here to do it within a class-based component, you use the constructor. And the idea is the same, right? We're gonna want to make sure that we define some state for our component to use. And that state might be is signed up. And it might start off as false, right? Because the user's not signed up. But just with this little logic of state now, we can do some unique stuff in our component to say, hey, you know, if the user is signed up, then we'll show something else, right? So the cool thing about React is the fact that you can use your JavaScript, you can use JavaScript expressions almost seamlessly with the JSX that you're returning. If the state is signed up is true, then we're going to want to show the welcome component. This would be an example of a Boolean expression. If to make this even more easy for y'all to kind of see, right? Maybe I change this all into a function, and it says render render components. Right, and render components might be a function that I want to create, so I'll create a new function, render, or let's call it something else. Show welcome. So this is going to be a function. And in this function, right, I might just want to do a simple kind of if else kind of thing, right? If the state is that, you know, the user signed up, then we might want to return the welcome component that we talked about before. Else, I might want to return the sign up component. And just doing something like this, right? This conditional is the conditional rendering we were talking about. And now I can have the component. I can have this class-based component kind of do a little bit more logic for me. So right now, the state is set up to be false. So we clearly are seeing our sign-up component, right? To make that a little bit more clear, I could add to our sign-up component. I could add a little bit of stuff around this to make that a little bit more clear for us. Right, and the idea being that, you know, we got to sign up. We're not signed up yet. One of the things I was trying to do was fix this to be vertically inclined. There it is. Not the prettiest, not the prettiest for now, you know what I'm saying? But you get the idea. Something like this. Okay. Yeah, I'll keep it how it is. Keep it how it is for the sake of right now. Y'all get the idea though. So the idea being that, you know, we might want our user to sign up, and then once they sign up, right? If that form is validated, we might want to let them know, we might want to let the parent component allow us to see the other thing. So this is where this idea of like passing the data between components gets kind of utilized, right? Like, oh, well, I want to make it so that, oh, like this this sign up component, when it actually is user off changed, right? So if the user changes their authentication in this sense, right? We might want to know, right? And so we could create callbacks. We could create little functions that we can pass as data to our other components to allow us to know more about what needs to happen at different points in time. And so this is the process of where like defining props becomes really helpful, right? Because now I can pass this function into my signup class, my signup component that can say something like, oh, like, okay, cool. Like, you know, once the user actually validates the password and then they get changed, and I can get some data from the other component using this props idea in order to connect back the data from here back to the other component. And so just to do this as a simple example, instead of just alerting yay, I'm going to I'm going to call that function that I just defined in here. I called it user off change. And do some stuff to just pass back information to the parent. So just running this function and using the prop. Well, the prop was passed into the component, right? So now I got to define what the data was that gets called. So this data is going to call this function. So when this function gets called, I might want to do something like change the state of is signed up to be true, right? So that we know that the user is signed up. And doing something like this now, right? We're taking all these pieces that we were just talking about of conditional stuff and making it so that, okay, if I sign up and, right, and I sign up, my passwords are validated. Oh, this didn't refresh or this didn't save or something. There it is. Right, if I sign up and everything is correct as it should be, right? Right, now I can see that welcome screen, right? And this is just happening with the state and the props, right? And so the idea is like you can use React to create these really dynamic types of experiences on your site just using state and props alone. But those things can get fairly complicated and can change in the working with them as they get more and more complicated might require you to use external packages, right? So for instance, what we were doing right now was a simple example of what you might consider the essence of like some of this routing work that we were using with React Router, which is what I was trying to talk about earlier, but the application was tweaking on me a little bit, right? And so, a library like React Router, which is the most important library to use for navigation, allows you to create this same kind of concept of navigation, but using even more sophisticated methods. But what do you think that is built on top of? It's built on top of the same stuff we've been talking about, state props. Just me doing this alone allows for that kind of idea of like, this feels like its own page, right? But the same thing can be achieved utilizing some of these libraries that are really important, like the React Router DOM library. And that kind of gets into that last point I want to make, which is that you can use React in conjunction with some of the more popular libraries that exist for JavaScript. And so there's so many cool things about JavaScript, and all of it is kind of stored within the NPM ecosystem, right? You can see all these cool JavaScript open source packages that people are using to make their experiences on the web that much more sophisticated. React Router is one of those things. And so we can install these really important packages and utilize them in these unique ways to like make our experiences on the web easier, right? And so as this is downloading, React Router is the one we might use for creating navigation and maneuvering around pages. But, something like Redux, like we were talking about the other day, is built on top of state and props as well, right? Just to make those processes of utilizing state and passing state and props that much easier to utilize while you are in the process of building more sophisticated applications, right? So the cool thing about using React is that you have all this dope JavaScript as a base. You can use it for all the HTML, CSS changes you want. But then on top of it, because it's JavaScript, you can use all these cool packages that are part of this bigger ecosystem in order to use more complicated, more sophisticated and more complicated libraries and packages in your work as well. And so, to kind of go to the idea of why like something like this React Router would be cool is like, well, yeah, like, now I can use the React Router and make my application even more sophisticated, right? And the idea is that as you continue to make your applications, right, you're going to be doing more and more sophisticated things, just like we're doing here now with this like React router package, right? Just getting to a point where we're going to make our routing a little bit more nuanced, as we might expect to do in as like the page gets a little bit more sophisticated. And instead of just kind of doing our instead of doing things kind of a real, like kind of old fashioned way, like we can do things in a way that's a little bit more streamlined. I don't know why now everything likes to mess up when I'm doing my thing. Interesting. I don't know why this is complaining at me, but the idea is the same, right? Instead of maybe doing some of these things on our own, right, we might use these packages to make things easier, add the ability for us to use these packages a lot more sophisticated and create experiences that are a lot more sophisticated on the web. Ultimately, I think that React is cool because it gives you the ability to take something that is a very interesting experience, which is using JavaScript in these creative ways, and putting it into a format that you can just grow upon, right? You can, whether you're doing like a simple project or a really complicated project, like all of these same concepts have been utilized over and over and over again on the web. And so what the library does is make your life a little bit easier so that you can grow in terms of the complexity of what you're trying to build with a simple library at the core. But just because it's simple doesn't necessarily mean it's not without its own challenges, right? It's because they made it simple, there's a lot of things about it that can be hard to understand. But the main points that I wanted to make is that just using like state, props, React components, functions, and everything we were doing event driven here in the little application we created, right, allows for us to create these really rich user experiences that are able to be reused and also able to create so much dynamic kind of value for our users on the front end. And yeah, just getting up to the point where you can utilize the React components and pass state and pass props and create these dynamic experiences is really all you need to know to get started with React. And then everything from there kind of grows from these same concepts of using state, using props, and making your experiences on the web that much more sophisticated for your users. And so yeah, I appreciate the attention and time folks have been spending on all of these concepts, and grateful that folks are tuning in to listen to it and kind of see how to get started more with the React-based landscape. I'm hoping that this all makes sense. So if it did, drop some thumbs, because you already know the vibes. That's how I be keeping myself accountable. But yeah, React is a really kind of nuanced library. But so long as you feel like you got a grasp of the main concepts, you're in a great position to learn and to continue to grow in your career and take it to the next levels that you want to for yourself.